Okay, everybody, we're gonna see this about a secret organization that controls 190 countries. Let's go.
What comes to your mind when I talk about the IMF?
IMF.
Well, for me, there's just one figure that keeps coming up, and that's $1.4 trillion. That's the amount of money that developing nations spent on just servicing their foreign debt in 2023. Now, mind you, this is just the payment of the interest costs. It doesn't even touch the principal amount. Interest payments amounting to more than $1 trillion. I mean, that's money that could have built schools, roads, and hospitals, just vanishing into gleaming offices of creditors in Washington, London, and Paris. Now look, when a loan is given, debt payments are logical, but that's just part of the story here. Because out of every dollar of aid that's given to the global south, $14 leave through underpriced exports, overcharged imports, and profits taken home by foreign investors. Over the past 6 decades, $62 trillion was drained, just extracted from poor and developing nations into banks and firms of first world countries. And at the center of all of this stands the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, the global debt enforcer. We were told that the IMF was there as a last resort to save nations from crisis, but in reality, it chains them to austerity, forcing them to trade sovereignty for survival. According to the UN, the developing world is $31 trillion in debt. Now, if you compare that amount to the US's debt, it's not really that big because the US debt alone is $38 trillion. But unlike the US, you'd notice that these so-called developing countries never really get a break. No matter how much financial aid they receive or how many reforms they're told to follow, the debt becomes harder to manage and life keeps getting harder for many ordinary people. Today, nearly 60% of low-income countries face debt distress, which means that when a country struggles to meet its debt obligation. And the scale of it is staggering because now we have a situation where many governments spend more money just paying back the interest than they do on actual development. I mean, every few years, the same story just keeps on repeating. A country runs out of cash, the IMF steps in, promises stability, and offers a loan. And every bailout comes with a manual on how to run the economy. But when you look at the actual numbers, the story turns pretty dark. Independent evaluations found that countries under IMF programs grew far less than expected. On average, the first-year growth fell by 1.5 percentage points below the IMF's projections. Now, that's not a small miss. That basically shows entire economies slowing down when they were supposed to be recovering. Meanwhile, the balance of power inside the IMF tells its own story. Out of nearly 190 member nations, one country, and that's the United States, no surprises there, holds a veto over every major decision. Overall, the global north has 9 times more voting power than the global south combined. So while it's a global institution officially, it's a boardroom essentially run by the richest economies on earth. And I don't know about you, but that sounds very much like colonialism. By the way, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel and check out my newsletter. You could have gotten this video 1 full day in advance and left your comments way before anyone else. But anyway, as I was saying, colonization never truly went away because now, instead of using armies, modern-day colonizers achieve that control that they want through debt, through high interest rates and policies written thousands of miles away. And to really...
How did EMF actually get started? You gotta watch a video about that.
understand how this all happened, we need to take a look back at what came before, when nations were breaking free from colonial rule and stepping into independence, but only to find themselves caught in a new kind of struggle. By the mid-20th century, most of the world held its breath. After decades of war and oppression, independence finally seemed within reach for many countries because between 1945 and 1960, many countries across Asia and Africa broke free from their European rulers. But freedom on paper doesn't fix what centuries of extraction destroyed. The borders they inherited were
Freedom, it depends on who wrote the history. I wouldn't exactly call it freedom, but yeah.
random lines
World power got centralized in the US. That's what I would be calling it. Centralization of world power.
drawn in old
Not freedom.
offices thousands of miles away. Tribes were split, rivals were forced together, and economies were hollowed out, When freedom came, they had nothing solid to build on. I mean, no industry, no infrastructure, no access to capital. Many defenders of colonization have claimed that colonial powers have invested in infrastructure of the countries that they occupied. But what they conveniently leave out is the fact that railways and roads that were built mostly led only to ports. It didn't really improve the country that they were occupying. No, they were just creating an efficient way to extract resources out of the country. So when independence finally came, economies suffered massively. The colonizers just left behind debt and division. So what do you do when your country is broke before it even begins? You borrow. And that's exactly what they did, and that's where the IMF comes in. The institution's founding goes back to 1944, when delegates from 44 nations gathered in the US resort town of Bretton Woods. Their mission was to rebuild a post-war world and design a financial system that would prevent another global collapse. Out of that conference came two powerful institutions: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, better known as the Financial System or Town of Bretton Woods.
Wait, let's just 1 second. Let's just watch which countries are here. Iraq, India. Can't see it, man. But all these countries, they're probably colonial countries of of Britain and America in France. France. It's actually funny.
Mission was to rebuild.
So the colonial guys who appointed these guys made a meeting to create what? EMF? Interesting.
A post-war world and design a financial system that would prevent another global collapse. Out of that conference came two powerful institutions: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, better known as the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. And the mastermind behind all of this was Harry Dexter.
Wait 1 second. We have Yugoslavia, Hungary, United Kingdom, USSR, Philippines, what's that? Norway, and I can see no more. What's that? Mexico? I don't know. Interesting.
All of this was Harry Dexter White. Now, Dexter had an interesting origin story. He was born into a poor immigrant Jewish family, and he understood what economic struggle looked like.
Let's just be all those countries just saw before, they were all created by the West also, by Britain and America.
Early on,
Yugoslavia was created by America and Britain, and I don't remember the other countries.
It wouldn't be until age 30 that he would enroll in college, and from there, his economic brilliance would soon quickly be recognized. That drive pushed him through Harvard and into the US Treasury, where he became one of the most powerful economists of his time. At Bretton Woods, he was recognized as a principal architect for this new post-war financial system, and by the war's end, he held in his hands a blueprint that would steer the global economy and the fates of nations for generations. And so the IMF actually began with good intentions. It was meant to rescue countries in crisis, offer short-term loans, and help them regain stability. When a nation's currency crashed or imports outweighed exports, the IMF would step in with temporary loans to fix the balance of payment problems. Now keep in mind that temporary is the key word here. Loans were supposed to stabilize, to buy time, to give nations a chance to breathe. But as history often shows us, temporary can reach into decades. And that's exactly what happened. By the 1970s, the global economy had turned upside down. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the surge in oil prices sent shockwaves throughout the global markets. Developing nations borrowed heavily, hoping to stay afloat. And by the 1980s, their debts had multiplied beyond control. A perfect crisis had formed. Policy missteps at home collided with conflicting economic moves in industrial nations, turning what started as a liquidity problem into a full-blown debt disaster. From Eastern Europe to Latin America, the dominoes fell one by one. The IMF stepped in with many promises of so-called recovery. In reality, the game had changed. These new deals came with heavier chains. They called them Structural Adjustment Programs, or SAP for short. Reforms that promised stability but delivered submission. Therefore, new bailouts pulled countries into a cycle of dependence. Each loan came with new conditions, more reforms, and tighter control. Ironically, governments began to shape their budgets around IMF demands instead of their own priorities. This was the birth of what many call the IMF debt trap, where countries could never fully exit IMF oversight once they entered it. The SAP became a long checklist, one that every borrowing country had to follow if they wanted access to IMF or World Bank funds. Governments were actually told to devalue their currency to fix balance of payments deficits. Public spending had to be cut, and state-owned enterprises were told to be privatized. Additionally, regulations that protected local industries were relaxed to attract foreign investors. Even tax systems were redesigned to assure lenders that repayment would be done on time. Even when these IMF-backed economies showed growth on graphs, the results were hollow because jobs disappeared, revenues dried up, and all local factories couldn't compete against the flood of imported products that poured into the country once trade barriers were removed. And sure, exports rose, but mainly from raw materials and low-value sectors. The profits rarely stayed home. Meanwhile, imported luxury products filled shop windows in cities where unemployment was rising and real wages were falling. It was a strange kind of prosperity, one that existed in numbers only. The real winners of these reforms were a tiny circle of business elites tied to export markets, trade middlemen, and transnational corporations that suddenly found a buyer's market in privatized assets. Now, logically, the criticism of the Structural Adjustment Program, or the SAP, grew, but the IMF didn't abandon the idea completely. They simply evolved it into a subtler but more dangerous logic of control. And now it came under a new, more technical label. The IMF now called these strict measures it imposed conditionality, basically a fancy word for control. At first, conditionality sounded more reasonable compared to the SAP that came before. It was meant to guide countries out of a crisis and protect the IMF resources so the money could be repaid. But as years passed, the conditions grew harsher. To acquire loans, nations had to cut public spending, raise taxes, and remove subsidies. They were told to privatize industries, reduce social programs, and open markets to foreign investors. Once a nation signed the deal, it rarely had room to say no. Each loan installment depended on meeting new targets. If you missed one, the next payment was frozen, threatening economic collapse. That's how the IMF took control of entire nations. With each new condition, the IMF's control deepened, and governments were forced to reshape their economies and keep the money flowing. Structural reforms pushed unemployment up, government revenues down, and costs for basic services became sky high. Tax systems, pensions, and social security all became reshaped for repayment. They all served their lenders' needs and not public needs. Rights were sidelined, inequality grew, and poverty spread. In these economies, the poorest paid the heaviest toll. And it didn't stop there. With the IMF reforms, funding for public services was often the first thing to go. Entire generations grew up under austerity, less educated, less healthy, and less capable of building the very economies the IMF claimed to save. You can see the damage in real numbers. Take Zambia, for example. Between 2018 and 2021, debt repayments jumped from 20% to 38% of the national budget. In the same period, funding for healthcare dropped from 9.5% to 8%. Education took a hit as well, falling from 17% in 2016 to just 12% in 2022. That's what happens when debt becomes a priority. The more the governments have to pay to the creditors, the less they have for investing in their very own people. Today, the IMF has undergone what economists call mission creep. It tells countries how to run their economies, what to sell, what to cut, and even how to write their own laws. It started with currency adjustments and debt repayments, and then it slowly crept into privatizing state companies, liberalizing trade, and reshaping banking laws. Each IMF loan comes with a checklist, and every box ticked means less control left for the country itself. And nowhere has that power been felt harder than in Africa, where the so-called reforms were supposed to bring prosperity, but instead left economies gasping for air. The bitter truth is that
Africa makes no sense. Bro, so much money gets put in Africa, but there's no result, you know? Those white guys, they're stealing all the money.
there are almost twice as many Africans living in poverty today in absolute numbers than there were decades ago. From 1979 to 1992, the entire continent's GDP grew by less than 1%. 13 years of reforms and nothing to show for it. Investment collapsed and factories have shut down. Apart from that, the continent's share in world exports fell by more than half. Africa once supplied more than a fifth of the developing country's agricultural exports. By 1990, that dropped to just 8%. In manufacturing, that fall was even steeper, from nearly 8% to just above 1%. For many nations, the so-called recovery programs didn't rebuild their economies, they hollowed them out. When markets reopened, it was supposed to mean opportunity. What it really meant was foreign giants walking in and buying up everything like ports, utilities, and raw materials. The continent opened up and wealth flowed out. The numbers say it all. $88.6 billion leaves Africa every single year, and that's nearly 4% of the continent's GDP, gone before they can build anything. Money that could have funded roads, hospitals, schools, now flows out as illicit capital flight. The continent opens its doors to foreign investment, sells access to its minerals, its ports, its energy, and now it loses its wealth it needed to grow. It's a leak that never stops. And what's worse is that this capital flight only makes the government more dependent on loans to survive. Governments trapped in IMF programs feel the squeeze. They're told to meet fiscal targets, balance budgets, and pay debts on time. When their revenues fall short, they...
It sounds like economical colonialism. How can this even be legal?
cut spending, first on health, then education, then social safety nets. Each adjustment meets the fund's checklist, but leaves citizens paying the price. Across the continent, the pattern repeats. Austerity balances the books but drains the economy of life. It strips away public investment, weakens local industries, and leaves societies more fragile than ever before. Because the truth is that the structural adjustment programs were never designed for Africa's interests. They were drafted to protect Western creditors and foreign investors. Even the leadership structure says it all. For 65 years, the IMF has always been led by someone from industrialized Europe. That's how structural adjustment began, a system that promised reform but ended up rewriting entire economies. And that chain of inequality didn't just stop in the global south, because once the system proved profitable for the very few, it was ready to be exported elsewhere. We can see a similar example when the Soviet Union fell. When the former Soviet economies were told to open up, it was championed as freedom. In reality, it was exploitation wrapped up in promises. The IMF's formula that once reshaped Africa and Latin America now found a new testing ground, and that was Russia. This time, they called it shock therapy. In 1992, Boris Yeltsin and his team of Western-backed economists flipped the switch overnight. Prices were freed, and industries were sold off, and government spending was slashed. The goal was to build a free market, but fast. The result was the most dire economic collapse in modern history. The country went from superpower to survival mode in just months. Prices exploded while salaries stayed frozen. Life savings were vanished, and shelves were filled with imported goods, but nobody could afford them. Poverty skyrocketed, crime followed, and life expectancy dropped drastically. Factories that once fed millions of jobs shut down, and as the economy burned, a few men got rich picking through the ashes. They bought oil, gas, steel, and banks for cents on the ruble. That's how oligarchs emerged from the ruins of a broken system. I actually explained this phenomenon in further detail in a video that I made about Russian oligarchs, so check it out over here. But frankly, Russia had everything it needed to rebuild. Natural gas, minerals, metals, a large skilled labor force, massive industrial base. But shock therapy turned all that strength into weakness. When shock therapy hit, the industries that once turned those resources into finished goods collapsed almost overnight. Whole sectors like steel, aluminum, machinery were gutted. The collapse of the Soviet Union also meant that many new countries that were once closely aligned economies were now on the verge of economic ruin, and it's no surprise that the IMF had stepped in to help. Zambia faced the same playbook under IMF pressure as well. The country's lifeline was its copper mines. They were quickly privatized and sold to foreign firms. The promise was efficiency. The reality was unemployment, lost revenue, and a government stripped of control over its own valuable resources. Those privatizations were carried out under IMF-backed restructuring plans that demanded foreign investment at any cost, and so the state sold its mines for a fraction of their real worth. Multinational corporations moved in with tax exemptions and profit guarantees while local ownership vanished. Zambia, once the world's third largest copper producer, ended up earning less from its exports than Chile did from a similar output because most of their profits just flowed overseas. Civil groups begged the government to renegotiate. It tried tweaking tax laws, but the damage was already done. Across the ocean, Argentina followed the same script. In the 1990s, it privatized key industries under IMF guidance. For a short while, money poured in, then came the crash. By 2001, banks froze, the currency collapsed, and millions fell into poverty. And all this happened under the watch of an IMF-approved program. You see, the story keeps on repeating itself time after time on different continents with the same formula. You see, people tend to think that the IMF is this sort of global safety net, an international lender that swoops in to save countries that are in trouble. That's the story we're told. Economists, politicians, and financial experts, they all repeat the same line, that the IMF is there to stabilize economies. But the facts on the ground almost never back this up. Because the truth is, the IMF has never been about fixing numbers or balancing budgets. History shows us that it's essentially a part of a much bigger system that's designed to protect the interests of the most powerful nations on Earth. So, when the IMF speaks of reform and stability, should we still believe that it's about saving economies? Or is it just about safeguarding the interests of those who already rule them? If you've made it this far, leave an Earth emoji or a world emoji in the comments below. I'd love to see how many of you made it so far. And if you haven't already, check out this video that I made about the Russian oligarchs. I think you'll really enjoy it. Also, subscribe to my Substack if you haven't already. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see.
Okay, what did we learn? We learned IMF is a piece of shit. Don't trust the IMF. IMF should be closed down, or at least reformed. So yeah, that's the point of this video. See you guys next time.